in just a moment and start letting the other folks in. We're actually going to take a minute or two before we'll start because we both need to sync up all the technology and again, want to give a chance for people to come join the call and then we'll begin. Okay. So, and as you'll recall, I'm just going to go through my opening kind of remarks, the land acknowledgement and all that opening remarks, and then I will introduce you. So we're really excited. I'm grateful that you're willing to do this. Grateful you're willing to do this to be a part of this conversation.
Is it, are people ready? Should I let folks in? Okay, so I'm going to unmute everybody. I'm going to mute everyone and then I'll unmute you as soon as I do this. Okay.
All right. We're going to thank everyone for coming in and joining us today. We're going to get started in just a moment. So we are streaming live on YouTube, which is pretty exciting, as well as on Facebook. So for everybody here on the call, there are more of you out in the world, and that's a very exciting thing. So I'm going to give it just a moment more, and we will begin. All right. Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone joining us today for a moment of silence in honor of those that we have lost in the last several months. The hundreds of thousands claimed by coronavirus here in the United States, and the ever-growing number of lives lost abroad. Those lives stolen through state-sanctioned violence, including police brutality, our for-profit prison system, environmental destruction, deadly immigration practices, disparate health outcomes, poverty, hunger, and much more. I'd like to ask if we can give 30 seconds of silence in honor of those who have gone. Thank you. So we'll begin with a land acknowledgement. Rights and Democracy is located on the land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people for thousands of years and is the home of the Western Abenaki people. Rights and Democracy honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we gather today. In that spirit, we will begin by acknowledging that we are guests in this land. We need to respect and help protect the lands within our use. Hello, everyone. My name is Kaya Morris, and I'm the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy of Vermont. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Now, I know there's some people that are here joining us that are new to Rights and Democracy, so I want to take a moment to welcome you and to share a quick history of our organization. Rights and Democracy, which we call RAD for short, was founded in 2015 on the theory of change that it takes people power year after year to make the kind of big, bold, long-term changes that we want to see in this country. Part of the theory of change is that it takes political infrastructure, and in this case, a membership organization to sustain the momentum necessary to do this work throughout and in between elections. RAD members and staff work on issues that matter to our communities. We organize for policy change at the state and national level and recruit and train a pipeline of progressive candidates to run for office. Our members are from all walks of life: intergenerational, multicultural, activists, artists, organizers, but most importantly, passionate fighters for true social justice and meaningful change in our communities and across the state. We have chapters across Vermont and New Hampshire, so look for us wherever you are. This is what we know. Our current systems are deeply dysfunctional, rooted in historical oppressions, and fragile. When those fragile systems break, it is Vermonters who have been systemically kept out of places of power who are the most impacted. Our Abenaki and Indigenous persons, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQIA individuals with disabilities, senior citizens, new Americans in our migrant community, youth and young adults, the poor and working poor are the ones who carry the weight of the policies and systems gone wrong. These individuals are nearly 80% of the Vermont voting population, yet the least represented in our state government, and are in some cases wholly invisible to those who enact the policies that can prove deadly to their communities. That legacy must end now from those seeking political power to earn our votes. But that relationship exists well beyond the voting booth. It is crucial that as candidates for governor, your relationship to our state must move from transactional to transformational if our democracy is actually to survive and continue to have meaning. Now understand, this is a mandate that we will vanguard today and into the future. Vermonters are suffering across the state and living with an uncertain future that is just not sustainable. From our climate crisis to COVID-19, we're tasked with doing things differently, radically even, to get from the place of where we are into the world as we most want it to be. Now, we each work in pursuit of a government that works for all of us, reflects us, and is responsive to our needs. Now, Rights and Democracy is a membership organization for all of us, and I hope that you joining us on this call will be able to join us if you're not already a member, so that together we can continue to grow this movement to win. And you can find us on the web at radvt.org, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. So now, let's meet the candidates. But a few little housekeeping notes for those of you following along. And in an attempt to minimize the disruptions, everyone on the call will be muted and able to unmute. So this means that there actually may be a pause between speakers as we get ready for the next person to go. And we have an incredible lineup of guests today, so we will not be taking questions from the audience, but we'll do our best to note any that appear in the chat, and if time allows, we may share it. We are recording this event, so keep in mind if you've got your video going, and we will post it to YouTube and Facebook afterwards. So tonight, we're fortunate the participation of 3 candidates for governor for the state of Vermont. Our participants tonight are, in alphabetical order by first name, Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman, Pat Winburn, and Rebecca Holcomb. Welcome, everyone. Before we hear from their candidates directly, it's important that we take a moment to state this irrefutable truth. All forms of systemic oppression and inequality in Vermont begin with its historical and current relationship to the Native peoples in this state, the Abenaki. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Carol Irons, Abenaki elder, to learn the status of Abenaki in Vermont. Carol's joining us by telephone. Hi, Carol.
Hi. Well,
hello.
I need to make the point that no one person speaks for all the Abenaki by any stretch of the imagination. We're pretty free spirit type of people. But I'll give you a little background info on me, and then I have some questions I want to pose for the candidates to be able to consider. When I was born in 1940, the Vermont eugenics program, it was all over the country, but Vermont had a strong program that had been going for a decade or more already. So my family was one of the many families that were hiding in plain sight and did not talk about their indigenous heritage. They talked about the Scotch heritage, but actually kept denying to me that we were Indian, even though I remembered teachings from a very early age and couldn't get that acknowledgement, which was so critical to my sense of identity. One of my brothers and myself were particularly outdoor-oriented, and we did a lot of outdoor activities. And my mother and my aunts pointed out to us plants, wildflowers. They taught us about the birds, some of the trees. One aunt was particularly teaching us good camping skills. So our outdoor activities were very deeply embedded with us. Although I went on to get educational degrees, we don't talk about that in the Abenaki community because that's a different culture. But in order to be able to have a stable income and take care of yourself in this world we live in now, we have to walk with a foot in two worlds. And I did do all right academically, and that's how, with a professional background, I could earn my living, but it was not the one that nurtured my spirit. The old way cultural values were very different than the Euro-American values, and so when one tries to walk in both worlds, as we have to now, it really can be very fracturing and splitting of a person's perspective on things. So it causes dissension sometimes simply because there's a values conflict. In our Abenaki communities, the process of group process is that we sit in a circle. No head is higher than another. In the Euro-American structure, it's a pyramid with ever diminishing layers of authority above the masses. And that kind of group process or social structure is now imposed on our tribes just because they have to have some structure to get approval and to show they're a functioning group. But it brings in a value system that has to do with dominance and authority rather than cooperation and trying to arrive by consensus at a decision. In our culture, the women have been the traditions keepers, and that is still so. However, we have a lot of people who no longer understand that, and we have some of the leadership that thinks it's male-dominated process. Well, that's the European or Euro-American culture again. So it brings some real struggles to our Native communities now in trying to do that. There are certain leadership qualities that we really brought from the 10, 12, 14,000 years that we've lived in this land. And there are a number of values that are actually critical to us functioning in a good, healthy way. One is respect. respect for all life, not just for the two-leggeds, but for all life on Mother Earth, including Earth herself. And if you have that kind of respect, you develop skills for cooperation and consultation rather than domination. Another value is honesty, integrity. We understand that on your breath, you give voice to spirit. So if you are deceitful or lying or hypocritical, it tells us that there's an indication of a twisted spirit. Humility is very important because that indicates there's self-awareness and a willingness to take responsibility for what one does and says. So humility is a leadership quality, very important. Courage was very strong, and generosity, not greed. Generosity, we practice now too. We feed each other. We take care of each other. One reason we have survived is because we take care of ourselves and our needs, but we share whatever we can that's left with our neighbors and our friends, not necessarily just Abenaki. So if you are greedy, if you're acquiring power or material goods or wealth, that's a sign of a shriveled spirit because it's contrary to the well-being of the community. So with that as background, I have some questions I want to share, and I'll start with an educational slant, and I'm just going to read out these different questions and hope that you'll take note and try to address them. Do you have any plan or policy to begin integration of Abenaki cultural knowledge into public school curriculums? What persons or groups would you approach for help with that? Can you see the potential in indigenous teaching strategies which recognize layers of knowledge within one activity or subject? Do you identify the dangers to society and to indigenous cultures of technology? Those are more directly the education system. The next set of questions has to do with the environment. Do you have any real idea how ecosystems work? Have you heard of the web of life? Do you understand the enormity of what this concept means in terms of interconnectedness and mutual dependency? What do songbirds do for ecosystems? Do you have any plan or policy to expand serious environmental education in our schools? What persons or groups would you seek out for help with that? The next questions have more to do with specific cultural knowledge in terms of Abenaki and other indigenous peoples in Vermont. Are you aware of how many indigenous groups, tribes, or nations have members living here in Vermont? Have you done any outreach to any First Nation groups here? Which groups or persons have you consulted with? Do you understand that no one person speaks for the Abenaki? Have you any idea why the Abenaki seem to have dissension? Maybe some of that background I gave you could help a little with that. Have you learned about 20th century history of Vermont settler culture and Abenaki culture? And then more specifically in terms of politics, I would just wonder which bills do you favor and why? And you may or may not have gotten copies of those bills, but they've been drawn up, and there's some effort to promote them. That'll take a year or two. We realize that. You've heard about the free hunting and fishing licenses. There's another one that has to do with sacred sites being property tax free. We know that churches and synagogues and mosques don't have to pay taxes, but our sacred sites have property taxes that make us extremely hard for us to hold on to them. And rolled into one of those others is one about Vermont signs being in both English and Abenaki as they're replaced, to be adding the Abenaki terminology. And I would recommend you check with the Bruchaks for the correct language on that. There's a bill about Native American scholarship program because many of our people, it's very hard to work your way through school. Some of us did it, but it's extremely hard. And there's a bill requesting funds for an Office of Native American Affairs. We do have a state commission on Native American Affairs, but by statute, it has no operating funds. It's been impossible to raise funds because many times when we try to write a grant proposal, the response is, I don't give to a state body. I don't give to a state agency. Would you support state funds for a Commission on Native American Affairs projects? So that's basically the questions that I have right now. And I'll turn it back to Kaya.
Thank you so much, Carol. You are amazing, and we are so grateful that you were willing to share your time and your stories and your wisdom, and it gives us much to think about. And we appreciate you lifting up the Abenaki voice, recognizing, as you said, that no one voice speaks for all, but many have never heard any. So thank you for initiating that conversation with folks who absolutely need to hear it. So we're so grateful for you and appreciate you being on our call.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. So as we think about this, I appreciate that. I want to give a slight pivot just to place this food for thought as well around, the challenges that the Abenaki are facing have much to do with the fact that they were never really given the legal structure that they deserved. They were not given the sovereignty that you see in other states. And so it's always an uphill battle against a bureaucracy to try to have your whole self and your humanity and your culture maintained when you are still considered a partial person in the eyes of the state. And you cannot be a clear state partner if you don't have funding. So that last little editorial piece just was from me. It's not speaking on behalf of anyone, but that's just Kaya using her moderator's authority. Thank you. Privilege, I guess I should say. Moderator's privilege. So now let's talk to our candidates. Hey, we have these amazing folks that we want to get a chance to meet, and we'd love to hear from them. So we're going to begin with opening statements from each of the candidates. If we can begin, I'd like to open the floor to Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rights and Democracy. What an amazing organization. As many of you know, I've been a longtime member and supporter because even in elected office, I still consider myself an organizer with one foot in the State House and one foot all around the state, organizing and working with people. As many of you are aware, of course, my name is David Zuckerman. I'm also a farmer, small business owner, and a father, and I am running to be your next governor. And I briefly want to mention to Carol's point about the web of life. As an organic farmer, I've named my farm Full Moon Farm because of the cycles of the moon. So I just want to bring that in here at the beginning. I won't be able to touch on everything in this first opening, but I've served Vermonters in the state that I love, and I know all of you love, for more than 2 decades in the House, in the Senate, and now as your Lieutenant Governor. And I've met and worked with thousands of Vermonters from all corners of the state, including many of you. And these issues that you bring up and the challenges that we all face are what motivates me to serve. And as we all know, Vermonters are struggling even more so now under COVID-19 crisis. And working Vermonters in particular are experiencing economic struggles that have only been further amplified by the current pandemic. Older Vermonters need our help to stay safe in their homes and communities. We need to care for our neighbors. We need students, especially those in the rural areas. English language learners and those with disabilities are struggling to learn remotely. Parents are trying to juggle childcare, supporting kids with their schoolwork, and often working from home at the same time. And we know many are experiencing trauma and abuse and will need support to overcome these challenges in this time. Now, our current administration has reacted well, and together, all Vermonters and these policies have helped us flatten the curve. And I want to thank all of you and all Vermonters for taking this seriously and doing all of our part to keep us safe. Let's not forget, this administration delayed or vetoed many policies that would have put Vermonters in a better place to weather the crisis, from broadband to minimum wage, paid family leave, and of course, climate crisis legislation. We need proactive leadership. For instance, leadership that would have recognized our unemployment phone lines would be overwhelmed. We need to put Vermonters to work today, hands-free sinks in schools, laying cable, accelerating the building of more additional housing. When I announced my run for governor, it was because of the urgency of the challenges and the opportunity to serve, to lead, and to do great things for the people of Vermont. This pandemic has exposed inequalities, but they were already there. 50,000 Vermonters or more don't have access to broadband or internet, and they're struggling to educate their children or get access or resources or work from home. Those who had small savings are barely getting by, and those who didn't are struggling tremendously. And we now see and value the role of educators in ways that we didn't before. We now know and value essential employees, and we've seen their role in keeping our society running. Why have they not been deemed essential before, and why are they paid such a low minimum wage? Our interconnectedness is even more apparent than ever, and I want us to build on that as we recover, much as Carol spoke about with respect to the web of life. We are all connected, and we all need to work together as we recover. As your governor, I'll bring those impacted the most: teachers, medical professionals, first responders, essential workers, small business owners, and Vermonters of all ages, races, and abilities together to try to find creative and forward-thinking progressive ideas. I'll be a governor who will lead and implement policies that get more money into working Vermonters' pockets, so when adverse conditions arise, we have fewer on the edge of economic disaster. I'll work with you to build an economy that puts Vermonters back to work with jobs that pay enough for workers to support themselves and their families through this crisis and any future crisis. Together, we must support our youth and listen to them and commit ourselves to fighting the climate crisis in a way that both builds our economic opportunity out of this crisis and ensures a healthy future for all. I don't know how it's possible that we're the only country where people are losing access to healthcare during the pandemic. We can expand healthcare access for all Vermonters while bringing costs under needed control. We can support our senior Vermonters by keeping them safe during the crisis and help them safely age in their homes and communities. We need more affordable housing with out-of-state and second homeowners looking to move to Vermont as a safe place. It's going to be harder for Vermonters to stay here and afford a place to stay. And as governor, I'm going to fight for investments for our future. This means including supporting prenatal care, early child care and education, our public schools, our state colleges, and technical training programs. These institutions are some of our strongest employers. They're central to our rural economy, and they're ensuring that we have educated, motivated, and trained future citizens. As your governor, I'm going to denounce racism at every time we see it and hear about it, and all hatred in every form. We must ensure all Vermonters are welcome. Those who are Indigenous, those who are born here, and those who have chosen to be here are all part of our vibrant and inclusive future. This campaign's not just about me. I'm wrapping it up. And it's also about bringing people together, as I have for 20 years representing you in Montpelier. I'm ready to bring my leadership, facilitation skills, and experiences both inside and outside the State House to Montpelier, but I can't do it without you. Please visit my website, zuckermanforvermont.com, to get involved. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. Up next, we'd love to hear from Pat Winburn, please.
Okay. I'm Pat Winburn. I'm running for governor. I'm from Bennington. And to begin, I'd like to take 10 seconds of silence for George Floyd and his family. I think what happened in Minnesota was a terrible tragedy, and it's reflective of the deep-rooted bias and bigotry and racism in some Americans. I've been a trial lawyer for nearly 4 decades. I'm from Bennington, and I live in Bennington. I've lived in Bennington County since 1986. I am a trial lawyer, and I'm the past president of the Vermont Trial Lawyers Association, and I'm the past president of many volunteer civic organizations in Vermont. I'm also the moderator of the Village of Old Bennington and a past trustee and Bennington Museum board member and so forth. But I'd like to talk about my beginnings as a lawyer. One of my idols has been Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow always spoke out for the oppressed, and he also spoke out for people who were discriminated against. I got my training, my first job. I was an intern and for Central Florida Legal Services, and in that capacity, while I was still a law student, we represented a lot of people of color, people who were from the inner city and by Florida standards, and we helped them with all kinds of difficult problems that they had. One of the cases that I remember most distinctly is a case that we had against Burger King. Burger King did not promote women, and Burger King did not even really hire people of color. With my colleagues at Legal Services, we brought a class action suit that ended in a settlement with Burger King, and it did change things down in the Orlando, Daytona area. And, you know, this was a long time ago. This was back around in the late 1970s. But since that time, I have always represented plaintiffs. I've represented the oppressed, and I've represented people who are powerless against the powerful. I represent people who've been in accidents and other kinds of civil suits, but those people are always bringing their claims, although people don't realize this, they're really bringing their claims against big insurance companies. And I've tried over 75 jury trials in Vermont to conclusion, and have had some success in doing that. But, you know, when I was in Manchester in Bennington County, I lived there for 18 years. I was a member of the Manchester School Board. And I also was a member of the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union and was an elected member to both groups. One of the things that I did when I was a member of the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union is I made a proposal that all of the children should stay home or be off school for Martin Luther King Day. And it was met with some fairly stony silence. And I think some of this was in the newspaper back at the time. But the only person who really came to my defense at the request was a Republican, more of an Aiken Republican, Walt Freed, who was a former Speaker of the House of Representatives in Vermont. And that request didn't get anywhere. And what I have always done as well is my children never went to school on Martin Luther King Day. And if Martin Luther King Day is going to be a national holiday, it ought to be respected by the state of Vermont. Why children go to school and don't reflect on the memory of Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day is really beyond me. I have continued representing people as a lawyer, representing people who are oppressed, representing people of color and all people. But I have a great deal of respect for civil rights and for public justice. One of my other heroes, aside from Clarence Darrow, is Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader may be remembered as somebody who caused problems and other tragic problems for the country in electing George Bush, but he didn't really cause the election of George Bush. George Bush Jr. Was elected by the people, and you know, as they say back then, he stole the election. He stole the presidency fair and square. And
thank you so much. I'm sorry, Pat. I apologize. I want to make sure that we have time for fairness, as it is a beautiful Friday evening. So I thank you. We'll have an opportunity for closing remarks as well. So I would love to hear the rest of your story at that time. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So up next, we'd like to invite Rebecca Holcomb to join us and give her opening remarks as well. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Kaya. First, I want to thank Carol Irons for coming and for sharing her story. And I think it's a good opportunity to just acknowledge that we're in the debt of the Abenaki and that they have an important role to play in addressing climate change, and their ways of knowing will be essential to solving the climate crisis. And I want to thank you, Kaya and Rad, for creating an opportunity for us to consider issues of equity and justice and racial justice front and first because it's an incredibly important time to do so. And I want to start by acknowledging the tragic and racialized deaths and violence that we've seen in the last weeks. Like Pat, this was very moving to me when I think of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. I know that their deaths are reverberating across the communities of color in Vermont. And I also know that many others have also experienced violence, but probably didn't get attention, perhaps because they weren't on a cell phone. And I have to also start by acknowledging that what feels so profoundly odd about this debate, given the focus, is to be here talking when so much clearly of what we need to be doing as white leaders in a predominantly white state is listening and creating space for members of marginalized communities to lead. I went back today to read James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. He wrote it in 1962. And it tore my heart to realize that it could have been written today. And Kai, I've met your son, and I can only imagine as a mother what so many communities across the state are feeling right now. And I'm going to use my time to offer his words back to you. He wrote, "This innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish." Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that. For the heart of the matter is here and the crux of my dispute with my country. You were born when you were born, and you faced the future that you faced because you were Black and for no other reason. The limits to your ambition were thus expected to be settled. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. And it pains me to sit here and say that that is where we are as a nation and as a state. And we white leaders who seek to lead the state can't look away. And over the past weeks and year, we've had horrible incidents, even in this great state, just last week in Hartford and another in Rutland. And we have to confront that history. Every time we fixate on a national incident of violence, that reverberates again through our communities here. I remember speaking to someone from Brattleboro after the Ferguson killing, who told me about how a third grade Black girl in a Vermont school whose friends asked her if she was going to get shot too. However well-intentioned, those questions just underscored the visceral fear that is a daily soundtrack in the lives of too many of our neighbors. White people can choose to go home from racism, but Black Vermonters have to live it every day, everywhere. And that's why as white leaders, and why I think we're having this debate, is that we have to grapple with our different levels of responsibility. At home, I'm taking the time to read more and to talk to my family and ask hard questions. I'm working to interrogate the assumptions in the media on which I grew up. And to lead the state as Vermonters and as white leaders who want to lead at this state, we have to lead at the social level as well. Many Vermonters, in fact, I would say most Vermonters want to be fair, but we also can see in policing, in education, in healthcare, and in environmental impact, our marginalized communities in Vermont face barriers and bias that push them aside and make it harder for them to succeed. The first thing everybody here today in this Zoom call needs to do is work to identify the racism and bias that shape our communities and commit to rooting it out, because the lives and the well-being of our neighbors depend on it. For that reason, we have to see it. And as your Secretary of Education, I worked hard to make sure all of our reports and all of our public data were provided information on equity and outcomes for historically marginalized groups. Because if we can't see it, we can't fix it. Second, to remedy bias and racism, we have to acknowledge that it's not enough to treat people equally. If racism causes injustice, then anti-racism is what causes justice. So we need to hold ourselves accountable for both seeing racism and discrimination and then working actively to confront it in all its forms. And as your Secretary of Education, I asked the Human Rights Commission to provide implicit bias training for every member of my staff, and that was only the start. We have to identify what policies actually create racism in Vermont or serve as bias in ways that create barriers to people who are just trying to live well and be well here in our state. So to help at the Agency of Education, we developed equity audit tools, which we use to evaluate every single proposal coming out of the legislature in terms of what we thought would be the impact on marginalized groups in Vermont. And even when it was difficult, we tried to push those concerns. Before a bill became a law, we wanted to make sure we had evaluated how it would affect our communities. But most importantly, those of you who've honored us by joining us here for this conversation should hold those of us who seek to be your leaders accountable for identifying and creating space for members of your communities, for insisting that you be at the table to help design new policies that undo racism and bias, and proactively work to protect and ensure the freedom of all members of our marginalized communities to enjoy the very same life, liberty, and happiness that every one of us desires and deserves. As Secretary of Education, I leaned heavily on the advice of those most likely affected by the decisions I made. And wherever I could, to the best of my ability, I tried to privilege equity first. I could not have issued good guidance protecting transgender students, or guidance on how to protect the rights of undocumented students to education, or guidance on how to administer federal funds in a way that helped rather than harmed marginalized groups in Vermont. I couldn't have done this without your help. So these are equity practices that will be at the core of my leadership. And as your governor, I don't promise that I will have all the answers, but I do promise that your communities will be part of creating the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for your patience in the Zoom world. I'm grateful for everyone to be with us as more folks are joining our event tonight. So now we're going to move to the question and answer portion of the evening. So just so that you know, as you can tell, this is not a debate. This is an opportunity for our communities and our constituencies to get a chance to hear from the candidates about the issues that they're most passionate about. So there are some direct questions that we're going to be asking, and each candidate will have an opportunity to respond. So we're going to begin with the economy. The economic impacts of this time are uncertain and devastating to many in Vermont. We have a growing unemployment crisis affecting thousands of Vermont families, while thousands more are so-called essential workers in this pandemic are being asked to put themselves and their families in harm. During this time, the need for policies that ensure a livable or dignified wage for all, comprehensive paid sick and family leave, fair working conditions and wages for our migrant workers, and workers' rights to organize and collective bargaining have been made crystal clear. Key initiatives that you will champion in support of improving employment and labor, and what conditions are necessary for those initiatives to be successful. They'll each have 3 minutes. If we can begin first with Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman.
Well, thank you, Kaya, and you're absolutely right. We do need to listen to Vermonters and Rights and Democracy's call for a livable and dignified wage for all, comprehensive paid sick and family leave, fair working conditions and wages for our migrant workers, and workers' rights to organize and collective bargaining. These are things I've been working with Rights and Democracy and other organizers around the state on for years. And part of this is that we have to shift away from the broader current mainstream way of thinking that anyone should be working below a livable wage. We need a leader, a governor, who's going to work with everyone and who's willing to champion that at every policy discussion, whether it be about taxes, wages, housing, education, healthcare, law enforcement, or more. It's the lens that we view our society and where we want to go that's going to shape the policies that we make and lead on in Vermont. Last year, I worked with Rights and Democracy and allied organizations on a statewide town hall series titled Building an Economy That Works for All. Across the state, we called for this shift in thinking. I regularly connect with Rights and Democracy leaders to identify people to share their stories, to bring those voices into the building, and to expand the understanding of the challenges facing workers and their families, and bring everybody to the table. I've long stood with workers and unions. I'm honored to have already the endorsement of the Vermont AFL-CIO, and I believe I'm the only campaign that's already unionized. I've joined dozens of picket lines as workers bargain for decent wages and benefits. I've also donated food from my farm to those workers, especially at Thanksgiving, when people are coming together with their families, and food is a huge part of the event. And in all 4 years of this administration, Governor Scott has attacked teachers and public education. This year he tried again, and I immediately issued a press statement against this proposal to revote school budgets, and a few days later held a roundtable discussion with educators about the devastating impact this would have on our public schools, students, and our economy. This proposal alone could result in 2,000 more unemployed individuals, educators, at a time when students need them more than ever. We have to address childcare as a huge issue in our economy. 80% of childcare workers are women. Pay is much too low. It's part of the gender gap inequity. The development of our kids from 0 to 3 is 80% of their development. We must invest in that arena. The pandemic has exposed the unjust economic reality that many in the majority of Vermonters are facing. I recently got a call from a trucker in the Northeast Kingdom who told me he'd been following the governor's order to stay home. He spent weeks trying to get food and get through to the unemployment system. Luckily, his kids got food from school, but he was going hungry. He was incredibly thankful for my help, just answering the phone, listening, and helping him get through the system. We must raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour and keep moving beyond to a livable wage. We must pass paid family leave. Obviously, we'd be better off right now if that had passed. Well, it did pass. The governor vetoed it. And it's critical, these policies, because they help our disadvantaged communities the most. It helps the working poor who are suffering under the current low minimum wage. It helps women who disproportionately make up the minimum wage workers and would help close the gender wage gap. And raising the minimum wage, let's remember, has been called a civil rights issue by organizations like the National Urban League because of how it would help the communities of color. I'm going to continue, as I always have, to support unions as governor. We know that where unions are strong, wages and compensation for all workers is better. We must support the right to organize, support card check provisions. And I just want to say all of these are examples of how I would work as governor with people and for everyday people, bringing them into the State House and into the process. And now, of course, we're learning we can do that not only in person, but we can include remote impact on the State House so more voices can be heard. Thank you.
There we go. Technology, we're also patient, right? Have we ever been this patient in our lives? We need to hold on to that patience in order for us to make it through. Up next, if we could please welcome Pat Winburn. We'd love your response to the question. Thank you.
Well, I believe that family leave should not have been vetoed, obviously. And family leave should also have been overridden and should have become law. I also have challenged Governor Scott to only accept the minimum wage of $15 an hour in the event that he would be reelected, which I don't believe that he will be. I think that what we have to keep in mind is who is not in this room and who will not debate is Governor Scott. Governor Scott announced today that he's not even going to campaign. He's done a reasonable job dealing with the coronavirus, but tomorrow will be a better day. And what happens after tomorrow is really what this campaign's all about. Governor Scott vetoed family leave. He opposed civil unions when he first ran for the Vermont Senate. He has done basically nothing about the terrible tragedy of opioid abuse in Vermont. And what's his response? I'm not going to campaign. I'm just waiting for November to roll around and I'll be coronated like a king. That's not the Vermont way. That's not, we're a brave little state and we shouldn't accept this as the way that people get elected in the state of Vermont. Governor Scott is, by all accounts, a nice person, but what happens when he gets reelected? Governor Scott is going to follow the same sort of policies that Donald Trump has followed. A Trump-Scott regime cannot be allowed to happen. And I think David is a good guy, and Rebecca, we all respect each other. But I think the reality is who wins the Democratic nomination, and they're going to be elected to be the next governor. And we cannot stand for another 2 years of Governor Scott with his cohorts at the White House.
Thank you so much, Pat. We appreciate you. Rebecca.
Thank you, Kaya, and thank you, Pat and David. Oops, am I unmuted? Yes. Thank you. One of the great privileges and honors of running for governor is having the chance to go out and meet Vermonters in every corner of the state. And we were able to do that before the shutdown. We've been virtual and are continuing to do it virtually all over the state. And what I carry with me is the stories that I hear. And I met a young woman in Addison County, and I have permission to share her story here. And I'm going to share it because it exemplifies so much of what is challenging about this state right now. She works full-time caring for people who are in medication-assisted treatment in Addison County. She works hard and she has lost her house. She's now living with her 2 teenage children in someone else's home. And she has no health care because she can't afford health care. She earns too much to get Medicaid and not enough to be able to afford it on the exchange and still pay for all her bills. And I think of this woman as I travel everywhere, because I remember also the poll that VPR did back in October, where they said that 40% of Vermonters felt they were a single check away from devastation, economic devastation. And we now know that over 50% of Vermonters have experienced some wage loss and are looking down a bleak tunnel and trying to make sure that there's a way that they can feed their families and keep a roof over their heads. And that's the landscape in which we are dealing with recovery right now. And as many people have said, and as my colleagues on the call have said, COVID-19 just pulled back the curtain on all of the inequities that have been here. And we entered COVID-19 with pre-existing conditions. Many people haven't seen any increase in their real wages in 20 years. At the same time, the wealthiest Vermonters has substantially increased their earnings. We are becoming 2 societies, or 2 Vermonts, one in which people can live quite well, and another in which far too many Vermonters feel like they're drowning on a daily basis and feel like no one notices. That's what I'm committed to solving. And to solve it, we are going to need to make substantial changes in how we make policy. First and foremost, we need to have broadband. And this is not just an educational equity issue, because we know that far too many children can't get education online right now. It's also an issue of equity and access on healthcare, because if you are a senior and you are anxious about going into your provider, you can't do that if you don't have access to broadband. So you may have to risk your health to go get health. Similarly, I talked to a home health provider who talked about how challenging it was to bring a fragile 90-year-old to the doctor in the middle of the winter. If we expand broadband, we actually have better capacity to give people the care they need. But in terms of economic opportunity, if you look at where people are moving and you look at all the news we've seen recently about real estate development, people are moving to communities where they have high-speed broadband. Businesses that are able to get up online, whether they're farms or distillers, are finding that they can access new markets and boost their sales by being online. But in the communities that don't have broadband, this can't happen. And we have to consider broadband just like electricity. It's a 21st century infrastructure investment we have to make.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to go to education. We're going to start with pre-K through 12. So this pandemic has challenged our public education system in ways that we did not know were possible before. Families are struggling to support their students in an online learning environment, and students who have disabilities are potentially falling through the cracks. Students from communities that have been historically marginalized will continue to experience separate and unequal outcomes from our private and public educational system. So my question for you today is, what do you see as a key root, or as key root causes, it could be more than one because there are, of the current challenges in our current educational system, and how will you impact those challenges in your role? Lieutenant Governor, can you begin us off?
Well, sure. Thank you, Kaya. You know, obviously the pandemic has further exposed the unequal outcomes in our education system, but it starts much earlier than that. It's about our societal envelope and what we do as government to make sure folks have the foundation and support to be the best they can be. So it's where we're born, the circumstances we're born in, the communities, and the opportunities that we have. So we need to look at all of these. And these are challenges and issues with the whole system. Some were created by the pandemic, but most were already there. It's really important, again, that we bring the voices in of those who are impacted into the conversation. Again, as Lieutenant Governor, I've been bringing people into the State House through their voices, through their messages, And through my newsletters, expanding on those voices to people all across the state, so that it's not just people in the State House that hear them, but it's people around the state to expand the voice of everyday people. I've held 4 roundtable conversations in the last couple of weeks with teachers to hear directly from them about the challenges of teaching remotely and what they need to do their jobs. It's particularly hard to hear the challenges facing those who are working with special needs students and English language learners, and how that is normally one-on-one and face-to-face work, especially without good broadband, but really without that personal interaction. We need to expand those services and help folks with those needs. We need to continue to expand understanding and open conversations around all students with disabilities. One way we've elevated this conversation was by showing the movie Intelligent Lives in Montpelier, Burlington, and Manchester. We had panel conversations with members of those communities to talk about their experiences and what their needs are with respect to education and training and community. And over time, we see that our educators have been forced to take on more roles, including basically the second job of being social workers. We need to return to when teachers could be educators and mentors and work to build our schools into community schools with a human services element that's not on the backs of our teachers. We need to help our schools be these community schools, offer more than education, combine these support services to help marginalized communities like the working poor, and this will help our disability community. It's going to boost our community, create more community in our towns, and it'll even help seniors who could be a part of that system as well. We must expand broadband access. We know right now remote learning is not an equal playing field across the state. And this again is critical for the working poor in particular and those who are disadvantaged. We really also have to do a lot of work. The secretary mentioned training and bias recognition. This is true for all of us in government, particularly those of us with white privilege, but everybody across government and in our educational systems. We have a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio of suspension and detention in members of communities of color. We tried to bring this up in the legislature. It was not supported to move legislation by the administration, but we need to continue now with a new governor to look at how we can help reduce those totally disparate rates of detention and suspension for communities of color. These are due to social biases, and we, of course, have to explore our own internal biases. There's a lot to be done with education. We spend a huge amount of money on it, and between that and human services, we can find both efficiencies and really open up a lot of opportunities for our young people to thrive in our state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. Pat. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Yeah. Please go ahead. Sorry, I have background things happening over here. I apologize. Please carry on.
Well, I think one thing we have to keep remembering is that the corrections budget is greater than the higher education budget. We've all seen the problems that have occurred in northern Vermont and the Northeast Kingdom with higher education. And one of the things that I think should be valued in a greater way is higher education for trade schools. My daughter, Sunrise, who's also my campaign manager, graduated from high school in Manchester. And really, there were no opportunities for kids her age. What she did was she went to photography school. She went to a very great photography school that taught her good skills, taught her discipline, taught her how to run a business. And then she moved to Brooklyn, where she had a lot of opportunities there. The opportunities that people have in big cities are not the same as they are here. And I have persuaded her to come back to Vermont, at least for the time being, to be my campaign manager. And one of the things she said to me was, you know, Dad, people my age look at Vermont as not being very racially diverse. People see it as a white state, and it isn't appealing, you know, to me as a younger person to come back to Vermont. And I think that a lot of people are in my situation. We have children. I mean, my daughter's 41. We have children we'd like to have come back to Vermont, but the opportunities are just not there. And, you know, one of the other things too is housing. Affordable housing. We need affordable housing in Vermont. It's sort of a chicken and the egg kind of situation, but Vermont is an aging population, and when the current problems with the coronavirus have subsided, we need to step into the 21st century, and that's when we really need to put the pedal to the metal and move into the 21st century and create opportunities for our young people in Vermont.
Thank you, Pat. Rebecca?
Thank you. Kai, you know this is a topic I love, and I could easily talk for 2 hours on it. And there's so many examples, but I'll just say a couple of things. Every child comes into this world full of hope and promise. People send what they love most to school, and our first job in schools is to care for them and protect their dignity. And we don't consistently do this. We don't do this in early childhood education. We don't do it in any sector at the K-12 level, and we don't do it as we launch our young people into college or the workforce. And I have learned that universal policies that are blind to our history of discrimination don't work. I had a conversation once years ago with a friend who said one of the most stressful parts of being a person of color for her was that when someone treated her badly, she didn't know if it was because they were having a bad day or because they were racist. And that creates stress and anxiety interfere with the ability of young people to learn. How we fix that takes nuance and caring, but it's non-negotiable that we fix it, because our first job is to make sure every child, no matter who they are, feels safe and supported. That's something I took very seriously as Vermont Secretary of Education. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of how I will lead. Even before the Obama administration, when we issued transgender guidance on how to support kids who are transgender in our schools, I didn't issue that by myself. I got enormous help from children, from parents, from organizations in Vermont that support kids who are transgender. And we use that input to design a policy that would make sure that our young transgender students were just as safe and protected in Vermont as any other child, because that's what we have to do. And I'm very proud that in our state, there was only one protest, and it was a protest in support of a transgender student. And that speaks to the power of leadership and using leadership to put yourself out and advocate for people. Second, when Trump was elected, there was enormous fear in many of our migrant communities. There was fear about what retaliation or what punitive actions might be taken against them. But under federal law, undocumented children and young adults have the exact same right to attend and enjoy public and primary secondary schools as any other child. And under state law, all children have to go to school. But meeting this obligation means beyond telling families that they have to bring their kids to school. It means working proactively to make sure those children feel safe. And that's why I put out guidance articulating how we can make sure children were safe. It's not always easy though. And that's one of the reasons I supported funding reform. And I actually, one of the last things I did as secretary was write the RFP for a funding study that suggests we've been grossly underfunding rural communities, communities that serve English language learners, and communities that serve our most economically disadvantaged students. And at some point we'll have to turn into that, because it's in all of our interest to make sure we put the wealth of the state behind the children who need the support the most. And it isn't easy because sometimes numbers are tricky. And when we worked hard on hazing, harassment, and bullying, one of the things that we discovered is some of the students who are most disciplined in the state are actually students with disabilities and students experiencing economic disadvantage. And what we found about racial harassment was very often the schools that had the highest reports of incidences weren't the schools with the worst harassment. They were the schools that were taking it seriously as a problem and working hard to correct it. So what I will do as secretary is make sure we gather the data and look hard at issues like harassment to make sure everybody's safe, but also work to make sure that we understand that when you begin to grapple with hard issues, sometimes things look worse as you begin to surface issues and you do the hard work of really making sure that children feel safe in our schools. And lastly, we have to invest in early childhood education. It's the most important investment we make. And one of the most exciting things I see happening in states and across the state right now is partnerships between schools and early childhood providers that take advantage of extra space in school buildings to make sure that childcare is affordable and equitable right at the heart of our communities. I spoke to one mother who told me she used to spend $185 a week to pay for childcare. Now she only spends $50 a week. Just imagine what it would do for young families across Vermont if we could leave $135 a week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologize. I appreciate everyone working with me on the time. I know that we all have so much that we want to say and we want to hear. I do want to be so sensitive to people's time on a Friday when we've probably been looking at a screen, many of us, for hours. So thank you so much for going on this journey. Okay, so our next question is actually around higher education. So Vermont State College system is vulnerable right now, and proposals have been made to close campuses. We know this is neither wanted nor feasible. Part of the reason that the Vermont State College system, and to a lesser degree UVM, are in this current predicament is the fact that the state has been disinvesting in higher education since 1980. We currently rank 49th or 50th, depending on how it's measured in terms of state support for higher ed. And this disparity impacts everything from staffing to financial aid available to college students. Are you committed to supporting efforts to increase appropriations to get us up to the national average? And how do you recommend funding such an increase?
I'm first, right, Kaya? Okay. Well, obviously, many people on this call experienced and were part of the call with a huge groundswell of grassroots movement when the closing of the Vermont State Colleges was proposed by Jeb Spalding. Clearly, that is the wrong way to go. We absolutely have to fund them both with bridge funding now and develop longer-term funding sources. I'm one of the only candidates talking about raising taxes on the wealthiest, and we need to look at that for funding many of these initiatives. I was holding a press conference on Sunday, 2 days after that initial announcement. We brought together students, faculty, stakeholders, and organizations to talk about these issues and listen to the concerns. And we had over 2,000 people viewing that conversation. And there were over 30,000 people who signed a petition to keep the schools open. This is critical for the rural economy, as well as the education and hope for our kids. We heard from one teacher, one professor, who talked about how their school, high school students in Johnson, the day that announcement was made, thought, my future opportunity is gone. They weren't gonna be able to travel to another school. They needed to go to schools nearby. And we cannot let that hope happen or get destroyed for these kids. And we must fund higher education with more resources. Think about it. These schools help our young people have opportunities for the future. These schools bring young people to Vermont, many of whom stay. These schools help Vermont businesses find and work with internships with those future employees. All of these are critical elements of these institutions. And as we move forward, it's not just more money. It's also developing a smart way to recognize what we're capable of while also recognizing the resources are not unlimited. And we need to take the opportunity that the pandemic has actually created of people looking to move to safer states. There are young people that are going to look to come to Vermont to go to school rather than large urban areas. We have strengths in our campuses, whether it's nursing programs, educational and social work programs, meteorological programs, video and technical design, and even cannabis at Castleton. We need to exploit and expand those strengths and draw people to Vermont for those jobs that actually we have a shortage of in Vermont in terms of the people to fill them. So we can make that connection. We have to elevate youth voices. What do young people want in education? Union voices. In the process, how can we streamline and or fix and help the institution with the expertise of our teachers and faculty? We have to elevate the rural voices that are impacted by these institutions, both for their opportunity and of course the loss if they're closed. We need to fund it through CARES money, if possible, further money from the federal government that will help municipalities, education, and hospitals when another bill goes through, and that's very likely. And part of who's the next governor is going to be someone who's got to have the vision to implement those resources, not to just rebuild the past, but to actually build for the future and invest in this future so that all Vermonters can thrive. Thank you very much.
Do your own thing.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. I appreciate that. Up next, please, Pat, would you be willing to share with your thoughts on higher education and funding higher education?
Well, it's true that things are not free. Everything has to be paid for. But with the advent of the coronavirus problem, is going to also come some federal money that's already been promised, and I believe it's going to be delivered by Congressman Welch and Bernie Sanders and his colleagues and Senator Leahy, who are all doing a fine job in Washington to help out. But one of the other things that hasn't really been talked about is if we're going to make pot legal, then we should tax pot. We should tax it just like we tax hard liquor and other things, but also set aside a portion of the funding that we receive and also some of the tax that we receive so that we do have education for our young people so that they understand what the problems are with drugs. But if it's going to be legal, then we should tax pot. My wife went to school and in Brooklyn, and one of the things that she did receive was a free lunch. She was not from a wealthy family, and it was an embarrassing for her to receive a free lunch. People say there is no such thing as a free lunch, but it had there was a price that had to be paid. And part of the price that was paid was by her humiliation in being one of the only kids who got a free lunch. So one of the things that I've proposed is that we provide children with a free lunch, but also free breakfast. The children of Vermont need to have good health. They need to have a boost when they start their day, and they can't be worrying about where their next meal is going to come from. We also need community schools. I believe in community schools, and I also believe in letting teachers teach and letting students learn. The teachers are doing a fine job, and I think that the teachers in Vermont are underpaid, and that's another issue that has to be addressed with some sort of standards to recognize the genius that they offer by their teaching to our children. And that genius isn't really being recognized in the way that it ought to be recognized at this point.
Thank you very kindly. And finally, Rebecca.
Thank you, Kaya. The state college system is so important to me because it represents so much more than bricks and mortar university. It is, for so many Vermont students, the only education opportunity they have for getting that post-secondary credential or degree. It's in our communities. 85% of the state college system are students from Vermont. Many of them are first in their families to go to college. And I've spoken to business owner after business owner who said that if the college wasn't near where they operated their business, they would not be able or would have no reason to stay in Vermont. These colleges provide economic stability, and as David mentioned, when people are unionized, particularly in the public sector, it's a real opportunity for equity and advancement for women and also for many people of color. And so they're a critical institution, and we need to keep them. And I also put out a set of recommendations and had a series of meetings because I am highly invested in making sure that we have a strong and vital state college system with a footprint in every place. Because when we pull it out of our rural communities, we're giving up on economic development and opportunity in those communities. And I won't let that happen as governor. But I have to say, it should not have been a surprise to anybody. Jeb Spalding's statement was just the culmination of years of petitioning for additional support. And Vermont's made a number of decisions, including we're one of the only 2 states that allows our state grants to go out of state. So we're spreading our money out in ways that other states don't do, and that reduces what's available for supporting higher education in Vermont. I also think that I agree with Pat. We've decriminalized pot, but if we're going to make it legal, we ought to tax and regulate it. I also think that the education proposal, the reform proposal that I proposed, would provide significantly more opportunities for schools, particularly in rural and high poverty communities, to be able to partner with colleges to tighten the handshake between our K-12 system and those critical post-secondary opportunities. And there are also opportunities to share resources. You know, we're all going to have to get used to, given the financial prospects that we face, to thinking differently, to go back to what you said in the very beginning, Kaya, to be transformational about every sector in ways that create opportunity, particularly for the people who need it most. This isn't just about creating more money. It's also about transforming our institutions so they create opportunity and vibrancy in our Vermont communities.
Thank you very kindly. I know that you all are doing very well. We're going to move on to healthcare now. So the costs of healthcare are skyrocketing, and our current for-profit insurance system is unaffordable for the majority of Vermonters. The state has not allowed let me take that back, because that's the complete opposite of what we've been learning. The state has allowed the private insurance market to place significant increases on premiums year after year, more than they've even requested. COVID may push some hospitals, medical centers, and doctors' offices to close. Our medical workforce is unstable, and prescription prices are ever increasing. What are 4 main areas of policy reform that you will support to guarantee healthcare as a human right for all Vermont residents? Can we begin with Lieutenant Governor?
Happy to talk about that. I've been fighting for universal health care for decades in this legislature, finally passed it, and then the governor unfortunately pulled the plug, prior governor, just as we were so close. And I know many on this call are aware of the heartbreak that brought to many of us after years of work to build the momentum for it. You know, I heard earlier a comment that it's basically a private tax as opposed to public, and people have to pay way too much for that private tax to have health insurance. We need to change this system. Drastic changes are needed to make sure all Vermonters are guaranteed healthcare as a human right. As you know, I've long supported single-payer healthcare. I've stood with Bernie, I've stood with nurses, doctors, Vermonters across the board in recognizing that this is a game changer for our health, for our economy, and for our communities. Excuse me. My first priority would be to move towards universal healthcare system, decouple employment from healthcare coverage, improve care for the uninsured and underinsured. This will help youth, it'll help seniors, it'll help entrepreneurs, it'll help the working poor. It's going to help many minority populations who have worse healthcare outcomes under the current system because they are not treated fairly. We're seeing that in the COVID outbreak, where communities of color are not getting the same treatment and are dying at higher rates. Healthcare should not be attached to employment, period. Number 2, I would expand the federally qualified healthcare system and options. I've also talked with some businesses who have set up their own independent, free primary care clinics for their employees, and they are saving money on their premiums. Why these businesses can do that when they're bigger business and have the opportunity and everybody else can't is beyond me. We have to make free clinics available for primary care and stop using the emergency room for basic care, which is way too expensive. Third, we have to adjust the insurance company reimbursement rates. My neighbor, who has her own independent practice with some other doctors, primary care practice in Charlotte, just sent me a letter saying they are going to have to close in a few weeks if the economic situation for medical doctors doesn't change, particularly independent doctors. They get lower rates of reimbursement from the insurance companies that pay more to the big institutional hospitals. We need to level that playing field and let these independent doctors that are doing a great job in our rural areas for primary care, we need to support them so we can have more primary care in our rural areas. Fourth is actually not directly healthcare, but it's housing and food. Safe and reliable housing and healthy food are the best prophylactic measures that we can take to improve Vermonters' health and save money. I know that from my own farming experience and what happens when people eat healthy food. We have to invest to make that happen. We have to support our farmers, support food storage, and make sure this food is accessible for everyone, not just those who can afford the higher price of local food. This is going to help marginalized communities who have had worse food access, which often leads to higher rate of food-related medical issues. And as we come out of the pandemic, we must look back on it as a demonstration of the underlying systemic biases in our healthcare system and our health outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, the pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color and Indigenous communities. I heard the story on public radio. I don't know if everybody else did out west with the high rates in those communities. And it is incredibly racist and unfair to have a healthcare system that is not accessible and equally accessible for all. And this disproportionately also the current situation exposes working poor who are essential workers to the risks of the virus. Thank you so much for the opportunity on this, because it is one of the biggest issues out there, from economic, environmental, racial, and life justice is a universal healthcare system.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Pat, your thoughts on healthcare?
Well,
Mhm.
I believe that healthcare for all is not only a right, but it's our moral responsibility. My wife, Kim, 5 years ago was diagnosed with metastatic adenocarcinoma, which is better known as lung cancer, that has spread because of the excellent medical care she received, but also because of the health care that I paid for through my mom and pop law office. I mean, I'm a Main Street lawyer. I'm not a Wall Street lawyer. But I believe it's my responsibility to provide the best health care for every one of my employees. And one of my employees is pregnant, and it points out the need for family leave, but it also points out the need for health care, good health care, and good health insurance. You know, if we have you know, health care for all, and we have it as our moral responsibility, people aren't going to have to do things like sell their houses because they have a health need. We can't have two Vermonts. We can't have people who have to you know, sell their belongings and sell their property or just not receive their care. My wife was lucky, and my wife was also the recipient of our internal health care that we purchased, but people shouldn't have to make that kind of decision. And I also believe that when the coronavirus vaccine is perfected, it should be free, and it should be plentiful, and it should be for everybody in Vermont. And I don't think that there should be any real debate about that. I am admittedly the only senior citizen on the panel running for governor on the Democratic side, but I have to tell you, being a senior citizen isn't bad. We have a second opportunity for taking all the experiences and all the things that we've learned and done, and that's one of the reasons I'm running for governor. I think that you know, our time has come that we need to draw on the experience of people and to provide health care for all, and provide this moral responsibility to all of the people who need it in Vermont.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Now we're back. Thank you so much, Pat. Rebecca.
First of all, Patrick, I wish your wife had grown up in one of the Vermont schools with farm to school and community eligibility, because she would maybe had better help. Like David, I think we need to set up to move towards universal care, and also look for ways to detach from employment, healthcare from employment. And this is even more important right now, given the ways our workforce is changing post-COVID, but also given how significant our job loss has been. We're the second greatest job loss in the nation. In terms of priorities, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the job done on payment reform. This is the payment reform, Kaya, that you helped pass when you were in the legislature, because that lays the tracks for universal care, but also for greater equity. This was actually put into law a while ago. We have still not done it, but what it does is it moves us from paying when people get sick to paying to keep them healthy. And when we talk about private practitioners and hospitals going bankrupt now, one of the reasons that they're going bankrupt is people aren't coming into the hospital, so they're not getting paid, or they're not coming into the practice and getting paid. Instead, if we had done payment reform, they'd be getting payment ahead of time to keep people healthy, and they wouldn't be in that financial position. That also underscores, to go back to your question, how important it is to beat down on those health insurance premiums until we've made the change to some kind of universal care system. Because of all times now, they're not spending, those health insurance companies. They should be part of the solution to our costs right now in this transition. The other thing I would do is I would use a health equity lens, just as I did it in education, so that we can clearly identify where there are health inequities and what opportunities we have to address them. Just consider one statistic. If you are a person who lives in poverty, you're 3 times more likely to have diabetes in Vermont. That's a a life-affecting condition that makes it difficult to be productive at work and leaves you more vulnerable to things like COVID-19. And in Vermont, it's driven by poverty, and we need to confront that and engage in preventative care so that all Vermonters have a chance to be healthy. I'll also lead on confronting implicit bias, because we have good data from Vermont that people in marginalized communities are often not heard or not getting the best care we can offer, even from people who really have egalitarian values. And that's because we aren't aware of the ways in which we hear or don't hear people who are different from us. We have to confront that bias, or it will leave far too many members of our marginalized communities underserved. I'll also strongly invest in workforce development for our healthcare sector, not just because it's important to the health and the financial stability of our healthcare system, but because if we don't find ways to make sure there are doctors in rural communities through loan forgiveness, for example, there will be no doctors in our rural communities. They literally can't afford to work there given the kinds of loans that they have when they come out of medical school. And it's also one of the best opportunities we have to both reduce costs in our shared system and move Vermonters into high wage jobs in our healthcare sector. If we, instead of paying people to move to Vermont, invested in Vermont students, like the young woman I met in Rutland, who was the first in her family to go to college, but graduated from high school with an LNA degree and 2 years of community college, and was able to work in a hospital where she got her RN. That's how we bring down costs, but also give great opportunities to Vermonters who want to stay in Vermont and be part of our health solution. And I think I'm out of time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We just have a few more questions, and I'm grateful for your time to share your thoughts on these. So now we're going to move on to our environment. So the climate crisis is upon us, and we must take action to mitigate the causes today to ensure that there's a viable future for our state and nation in years to come. From the promotion of electric cars to weatherization programs, there are a number of solutions and innovative programs underway in the state to create a green future. Rights and Democracy holds a vision for a green future where we commit to working to rebuild and renew our state by developing thriving, equitable, and sustainable local economies that center the priorities of workers and frontline communities and create good-paying unionized jobs, building a zero carbon energy sector by 2030, and zero carbon building and transportation sectors by 2040, and by enacting reforms that make our government more inclusive of and accountable to the communities that it serves. Do you share this vision? And what are some key initiatives that you plan to champion to get us there? Could we begin first with Lieutenant Governor?
Sure, and thank you, Kaya. Obviously, I share this vision completely. Anybody who's seen my work over the last 40 years, you've seen that 40 years. Since I've been 8 years old, I've been working on this. No, the last 20 years in the legislature on the Agriculture Committee, the Natural Resources Committee, and introducing legislation around climate crisis, issues around our environment, clean water, clean food, and as an organic farmer, this is deeply at the heart of my passion in my public service, and the recognition that a clean environment, healthy food, and a healthy opportunity for people to live and thrive are all incredibly closely linked. Back in college at UVM, I organized Earth Day. At that point, it was the 20th anniversary in 1990. I've worked in the legislature calling for divestment from fossil fuel companies, renewable energy advocates, and to add to the renewable energy opportunities for Vermonters that this governor has been cutting in the last few years. And of course, we have to formally recognize the threat of the climate crisis with the Global Warming Solutions Act. As Lieutenant Governor, I've worked to support weatherization funding. And even a few years ago, when it was suggested we add 4 million, I said, let's go for 20 million a year in weatherization, because that not only helps the environment, but it helps working people and seniors stay in their home. As an organic farmer, I'm working to build the soil, sequestering carbon with cover crops, put solar panels on the roof of my barns to try to offset our energy use. We have to do it both walking the walk and with policy. And as many know, right when Green New Deal started coming out as a conversation, I said, let's do a Green Mountain New Deal. Let's invest about $100 million a year of the Trump tax cuts that are going to the wealthiest 5% of Vermonters over the next few years to expand broadband, which would help with telecommuting. We're actually one of the highest per capita mileage driving states in the country. This will help our rural areas. It'll help the working poor. It'll boost the economy in our rural areas. We obviously have to do education and economic rural development, which broadband would help with. We need to develop our village centers and town centers with denser, energy efficient, affordable housing so that people can afford to stay and live here. Because as out-of-staters are buying our properties for the safety from the pandemic, it's also going to drive up the prices. Welcome to the free market economy, everybody. It's going to drive out a lot of Vermonters unless we invest in affordable housing. Again, helping the working poor, seniors, communities of color who are often in the lower wage work jobs, and it's going to reduce our carbon footprint. We absolutely need to do more, as I said earlier, weatherization of seniors' homes and working class Vermonters' homes, not with incentives that you need money up front for, but actually get these grants or low interest loans that can help people do it and they can pay them off with the savings. It shouldn't just be wealthier folks who can use tax credits to offset their environmental improvements to their homes. And obviously, again, I'm going to get back to food. We have to expand local food production. We have to expand processing. We've got difficulty with processing facilities for our animals. We don't have enough storage facilities, and we need that to improve our resilience and reduce our carbon footprint of importing food. And of course, this will also help make food more accessible to Vermonters of all stripes, and particularly working class and minority communities who are disproportionately affected by food-related health conditions. I'm going to wrap with, race and income are highly correlated with food access, and we have to address that. And finally, we have to reinvest in diversified renewable energy production. The governor has cut that. If we actually could invest in that, we would put more Vermonters back to work and be saving money. We need to do both jobs and the climate together. And there's so many opportunities with a creative governor and creative work. Thank you.
Thank you. And up next, please, Pat, please share your thoughts.
Well, I think all of the reputable scientists and the experts in the field believe that climate change is real. I don't think there's really any serious controversy about that. And I also, believe in being net zero by 2050. I don't really see that Governor Scott has done anything in that direction. He opposes a tax on carbon emissions, but he doesn't offer any alternatives. One of the things that I've proposed is a new Deal. It's reshuffling the deck. We take everybody got dealt a deck hand, from the deck of cards back in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, what we need to do is we need to flip over the deck, have a dialogue among the legislators who have already had some pretty interesting and good ideas that have been stopped by Phil Scott. And once we turn the deck of cards over and we see a new hand, everybody gets a new hand. We get a new deal, we get a fair deal. That's what Vermonters want. And that's what I think that Vermonters deserve. We have to do better. And I think we will be doing better under Governor Winburn administration. And I hope that people will realize, though, also that things do have to be paid for. And one of the ways that we pay for things, aside from some of the proposals that I've been mentioning before, is we're going to have some money that's coming from the federal government that's already been earmarked and sort of, funded for Vermont. We have to use that money. We have to be smart about it, but we do have to move into the 21st century. And, I believe in being net zero by 2050.
Thank you so much, Pat. Rebecca.
I just want to start by acknowledging that this is one of the moments where coming last gives you an advantage in the debate. So I want to thank my two colleagues who went previously. I think this is an issue on which we have very little distance. We agree that we have a climate crisis. We agree that we need to work aggressively to address it. And we agree that we need to seize it as an economic opportunity to invest in Vermont, take that $2 billion we spend out of state every year on fossil fuels and turn some of it back into Vermont workers who live in Vermont, buy goods and services from other Vermont workers, and and contribute to our shared economic community wealth. But I want to also talk about some other issues. And, you know, I want to go back to what Carol Irons said at the very beginning, which is that so often we're an ecosystem, and so often the actions that we take can disproportionately burden or hurt some communities that are marginalized and maybe aren't consulted in the process. I remember vividly after Irene seeing places where, because of a ferocious storm that had been triggered by climate change, entire trailer parks were washed out because they happened to be living along the edge of the river. And they've been the most hurt by some of the effects of climate change. And those are the people we need to pay attention to in the transition to ensure that they're part of a resilient future. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that our solutions must also be equitable. And as we make this transition to a green energy economy, which we absolutely have to do, there is a trade-off between speed and equity. And there are trade-offs as we move, and we need to be very attentive to who might be hurt and who do we need to help. One dilemma, for example, is that we as a state depend very heavily on out-of-state green energy from Hydro-Quebec. It supplies a huge percentage of our electricity, and it is sustainable, and it is a huge benefit as we try to move and address climate action. But it is also Hydro-Quebec, where one person who lives up near Hydro-Quebec, it is impacting negatively the indigenous communities around it and exposing them to mercury pollution. And one of them said in an article written by a Vermont reporter, you're buying the misery from the local people of Northern Canada. That's not a good thing. And we just have to be mindful of how solutions can have unintended consequences and think about how we move in ways that intentionally are respectful of and support the people who may be adversely impacted by our solutions. So equity has to be part of everything we do and part of our climate solution. So we need to move with urgency because we are in an emergency. And we need to also make sure that as we move, we are making sure to use this to create opportunity and protect the health of our most vulnerable Vermonters.
Thank you. And so now we're to our final questions, and then we'll go to closing remarks. So this is in the area of criminal and racial justice. So our criminal justice system, it needs a major reform. Vermont has the highest rate per capita of Black men incarcerated. Interactions with law enforcement show significant racial disparities in police interactions for people of color. Over-prosecution of substance abuse-related charges is a common occurrence, and Vermont residents are being detained in ICE facilities throughout the region. How will your office influence the application of criminal justice reform in a way that brings true equity and equal application of the law for all impacted persons? Can we begin first with the Lieutenant Governor? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kaya. A critically important question, obviously, in this moment and in all moments. This is a multi-generational systemic issue that's been going on and been untackled for far too long. It starts with everyone, especially those of us who have the privilege of being white. We have to explore our own biases and really learn the full history. When I was in high school, my US history textbook was Howard Zinn, A People's History of Ourselves. You want to talk about learning about the full range of history from the indigenous cultures to the treatment of different minority communities in this country. That should be required reading in high school so that young people start learning much earlier in life about these systemic challenges and history that have created what we've got going on. We see bias and racism in Vermont with higher incarceration rates, and we see it in our schools. The racism in our society has forced, obviously, our lead moderator here, highly qualified and important voice, out of the legislature. That is completely unacceptable, and she was not defended as well as could be in that process by our institutions. We see bias and racism across the country with what happened to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin. You all know, I could just list for 3 minutes the numbers of names and it wouldn't even touch the injustices that are out there. We can no longer have communities of color seeing authority figures murdering their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. This is not acceptable. We have to expand funding for the Office of Racial Equity so that one person doesn't have to tackle this alone. That's absurd to have one person who's got to do this with no staff. We must fund more in that arena, and as was talked about earlier, the Commission on Native American Affairs so that we can have much better education and programs across our state for, again, those of us with privilege who were not taught of that privilege and were not taught the appropriate lessons of history. We have to talk about these institutional issues and personal biases. As Lieutenant Governor, I prioritized this. When I launched my Lieutenant Governor movie series, the very first movie was 13th, which explored and exposed the institutional racism in our own Constitution. There were more than 50 people in the State House cafeteria for that movie. And I clearly remember a woman who stood up crying at the end of the movie and expressing deep anger and sadness that she had no idea of the connection between slavery and mass incarceration. We absolutely must review and drastically change our police training system. We have to include and emphasize bias training over and over again, de-escalation tactics and techniques, demilitarize our police force, invest in recruiting more diverse police corps. We have to review parole violation penalties and make sure people aren't incarcerated or reincarcerated for minor violations. We have to expand education and technical training in our prisons and better prepare incarcerated individuals. When I met with the folks at Rhino Foods, they work with the women coming out of the Chittenden Correctional Facility to put them into work, but they have found the number of impediments to people coming out of the incarceration system is incredibly difficult when they have to meet with parole officers, they don't have transportation, and they're trying to hold down a job, and many, many other hurdles. We have to reform and possibly remove bail requirements, certainly cash bail, and all of these disproportionately affect communities of color, and those are economically more challenged. And finally, as cannabis was talked about earlier, as many people know, I've been a leader on addressing the racist policy around cannabis and other war on drug policies for 20 years in the legislature. When I ran in 1994, I was talking about reforming the cannabis laws because of the war on drugs and the anti-peace movement and the civil rights movement and how cannabis was used to suppress those movements. These have been tools of government and corporations to keep people down. We have to reform that, not just for the tax revenue, which we should have and we should use to make sure those who are disproportionately affected by these policies also have money and opportunities to invest in that future economy. It's got generational challenges, racial disparities, and of course, economic disparity with respect to who's incarcerated. The war on drugs has got to end, and we've got to invest in education and supports for people, not incarceration. And finally, I would make sure, like I said, that those who have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs and unjust criminal activity with our communities of color and others get support to build their economy. We have such wealth inequality because government policies have disproportionately supported white people through history, from redlining and World War II supports and the GI Bill, that have kept people down. And we have to know that and reverse it every single day.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Pat?
Well, I have addressed some of these issues in my opening comments, but also, too, I think it's important to recall that there was a racial justice forum in Bennington that had many eloquent speakers. We had local civic leaders, and we also, had members of the ACLU that addressed the issue, right on the money. I mean, we cannot accept bigotry. We cannot accept racism. Groups like Migrant Justice up in the northern part of the state are doing very interesting and very innovative and important work. But we also have to keep in mind too that there are other minority groups. There the lesbian, transgender, gay community hasn't been properly represented, and I believe that minorities should be represented and be in positions of power in the state government. I don't know how many of you remember the great civic leader out in San Francisco, Harvey Milk, who was assassinated and died for his views. I think that that's why we need to promote education in our schools in Vermont. We need to have gay, straight alliance clubs. And I think we also have to remember that there was an AIDS crisis that was devastating to people back in my day. And because of the miracles of modern medicine, people have overcome these illnesses so that they can have a better life. And that's why healthcare also is so important, and why it is a moral imperative that we provide health care for our citizens. And, these are the things that I believe. I do believe that minorities should be represented in state government, and they should be given a seat at the table in the governor's office and in the governor's cabinet. They should be vetting the people who are appointed to these cabinet positions. And I think that there should be minorities, including the Abenakis, who are represented in an official capacity in the governor's cabinet. And these are all things that I'll do when I'm elected.
Thank you very kindly. Rebecca.
Thank you. So, Kai, this issue is heavy on all of our hearts tonight, and fixing our justice system will require hard work at every level to make sure that it's equitable and accountable to all the citizens it serves. We in government don't deserve trust. We have to earn it, and this is an issue on which we have a lot of work to do. I spoke with a friend recently who does a lot of work related to juvenile justice and criminal justice reform in Vermont, and she told me a story about walking in to Woodside the first time. And when she arrived, every single child she saw there was a child of color. And all she could think is, how could this be in a state this white? And in fact, she was right to worry. As you mentioned, after study in Vermont shows that people of color in Vermont are disproportionately stopped and searched by Vermont law enforcement, and racial disparities in our prison system are among the worst in the nation. And a study recently, as Pat suggested, conducted by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, this is a professional association, found that the Bennington police exhibited a warrior mentality. And 1 in 5 respondents reported feeling discriminated against by Bennington Police Department officers. It isn't just people of color, and to be blunt, it isn't just our justice system. People with disabilities and people who live in poverty and people with mental health challenges are also overrepresented in school discipline data and in our prison system. It's hard to look at our data and not worry that as a state, we are criminalizing people for being sick, for being poor, for being disabled, and for being Black. And then think about the impact on all of their families. 6,000 children each year are impacted by having a parent who's incarcerated. And I saw that on the front lines in our school systems. We need to start early to change that. And we have to change that at every level. In education, to prevent a school to prison pipeline, we need to aggressively engage in implicit bias training and to make sure that the materials we use reflect the communities that we serve and support their potential. We need to identify and reject policies that contribute to racial bias in the justice system. This is one of those several reasons I do not support placing police officers in schools. There's very little evidence they make schools safer, but there's a lot of evidence that they tend to be placed in schools that serve a lot of kids of color, and that they increase the likelihood school discipline incidents become criminal incidents and end up in the justice system. And police departments can build trust by adopting data-driven policies that ensure that their practices are equitable. But even more importantly, again, to go back to something that Carol Irons said, we can support our police departments by adopting civilian oversight models that bring our communities together to talk about how we care for people. And we can support our officers by providing better training and de-escalation. A warrior mentality has no place in public safety and no place in any form of government at any level. And as any of us reading the powerful coverage events over the last 2 years at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility sees, it's very possible that we all have a lot of work to do to be less punitive and more restorative. I again say that we may have people in jail simply because they're poor or don't have access to treatment. We need bail reform. 44% of people being held pre-trial were people who were there because they were under conditionals that involved money bail, and many of them probably couldn't pay. They're there because they can't pay. We can have parole reform. Here's a shameful fact. As of September, 125 people were incarcerated in Vermont in 2018 because they didn't have housing. We're keeping people in jail because they don't have housing. That's wrong. As your governor, I'll make sure that doesn't happen.
I appreciate that. So, and I appreciate everyone's patience. I know that everyone's taken different liberties with their time tonight. So, and we are almost done. We're at the point now of doing closing statements. So actually, I would like to mix it up myself if we don't mind, and we'll go in reverse order. Will that work for folks? I know we weren't expecting that, but I want to give everyone an opportunity, and I know everyone's had different ways. So this would be a nice opportunity for us to show our flexibility and our resilience to change. Rebecca, would you be willing to start us off with your closing statements, and then we'll go to Pat, and then we'll go to Lieutenant Governor. Thank you.
I just got unmuted, but I think you're going to Rebecca.
I think I'm unmuted, David. I think this is equity in action. It's good that we're mixing it up. So I support it. And thank you, David, for bearing the brunt of that tonight. I just want to ask everybody to end this night by thinking about that feeling you get. Maybe you've worked really hard, you've been really tired, and no matter what you do and no matter how hard you work, you just can't make things work. You can't make things work. You know, I've been a principal and a district leader. I remember sitting down with a mother one day when she came in. She was taking care of her son, who was an 8th grader, and also taking care of the child of her sister, who was struggling with addiction. She'd taken her into her home because her sister couldn't care for her. She also was working very long hours as a home health aide, taking care of other people, but it was low wage and she could not afford to pay her bills. We were worried about her house because it was next to a toxic waste site and we weren't sure what that was doing to her family. And she sat down, she looked at me and she stopped crying because she was worried she couldn't pay for her food for lunch at school. I think about this mom all the time because it explains so much to me about what is so broken about Vermont. Vermonters want dignity, they want charity. And I think of that when I look at the cars lining up at Berlin Airport and in Burlington and around the state. They're there because we have an economy which even before COVID-19 is one in which no matter how hard some people work, no matter what they do and how much value they bring to all of us, they still feel like they're drowning, even as others thrive and don't even appear to notice. But people like this mom, they're raising the next generation of Vermonters. They're filling the gap in our social services and caring for the rest of us when we're sick. And in so many ways, they are the underappreciated backbone of our state. And we owe them better. We owe them paid family and medical leave. We owe them livable wages. We owe them opportunities to improve themselves through good education that lets them move into job security and a middle class wage. We owe this to them because they are a part of us. They are a community and we need to do better. When they do better, we all are better. And when they struggle, we all struggle. So I have been saying that getting back to normal is not enough. Instead, we need to create a new Vermont that is better, that is green, and that ensures that every Vermonter, no matter who they are, can work hard and live a good life and feel like they're part of a strong community. When we make sure everybody is able to care for themselves and their children, we are all better off. And we need to take extra care to do that with our marginalized communities because their health tells us whether we are healthy as a state. As your governor, I will make that my priority. I encourage you to go to my website. You can read more about some of the statements I've put out on education reform and equity. And you can also find a way to reach me if you have follow-up questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Pat.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you, Kaya Morris, for doing such a wonderful job as our host this evening, for her eloquence and grace in fielding the questions and asking us the hard questions that need to be asked. And I'd also like to thank Carol Irons, her moving comments at the beginning of this debate and forum this evening remind us why we all need to be careful and we all need to be respectful and we all need to understand that the indigenous people were here first, and that we need education in our schools. I've fought insurance companies in the courtrooms for nearly 4 decades. I've taken on the Allstates, who they're not like, and the people who are not like a good neighbor, I can tell you. And I fought for the powerless against the powerful, and have achieved some justice for my clients, and I'm proud of that. I've also been appointed as an assistant superior court judge, and I've served in both Bennington and Windham counties. It's sort of like being a substitute judge, but I've dealt with the issues in cases where there's gun violence, and there are problems that have to be addressed in a serious but respectful way. And finally, I would just say, anyone who would like to know more, be sure to go to windburn2020.com. Come by and see me anytime on Main Street in Bennington, and I'm always happy to talk to everybody.
Thank you so much, Pat. And finally, Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you, Kaya, Rights and Democracy, everybody who has attended all evening long, for the work you've done, not just bringing this together, but the work you do on a daily basis, organizing, bringing this information to Vermonters, expanding the conversation, and really building the grassroots movement that's going to make it feasible and possible for any one of the 3 of us who wins this nomination and then wins the governorship to be able to implement these kinds of policies. Carol, you brought up so many important issues. You did ask a couple questions, and I just want to mention that there are more than this number, but I know the main 4 different tribes within the Abenaki are the Elnu, the Coassac, the Nulhegan, and the Missisquoi. And I also want to talk about making sure all those voices are brought in. And I've worked with many of the different leaders in the State House and outside the State House to bring those voices into the process. I will certainly advocate for the policies you talked about, the fishing and hunting licenses, the sacred sites tax exemption status, and the idea, it's a brilliant one, to add to our road signs the locations as they're named as they were for thousands of years. Now, to get to the governor's office, we need to win. And I think it's really important to see that the coronavirus crisis has certainly made the race to beat Governor Scott harder than it would have been otherwise. We have to acknowledge reality. But everyone in this virtual room knows that we don't need this continued reactive leadership where he's gotten in the way of good policy and he hasn't really been proactive on much of anything at all. We need proactive leadership on so many of the issues that we covered today: the economy, education, the climate, healthcare, environment, criminal justice, human rights, and on, all the issues that Rights and Democracy care about. So many of the policies that Governor Scott has scoffed at, he's delayed, he's vetoed, would have put Vermonters, and especially marginalized communities, in a stronger place to address this virus. Broadband, minimum wage, paid family leave, all would have put Vermonters, and especially Vermonters in marginalized communities, in a better position. We need to win this governorship so that we're not just talking about what we would do, but so that we can implement the real policies that will help Vermonters. I've listened to Vermonters and been a public servant for 22 years, bringing these voices in and effectively working with you to pass legislation on GMOs, minimum wage, end-of-life choices, marriage equality, affordable housing, and more. Being an organizer and working with Vermonters is the way to get those voices into the system to get these policies passed. And I have the experience to do that. I've also won statewide office twice and represented all Vermonters for the last 4 years. In 2018, some people may not realize this, but I received over 7,000 more votes than Phil Scott. This was the result of organizing as a publicly elected official on issues which built long-time personal relationships throughout the state and across all of these issues and ideologies. Vermonters know me and they trust me. So I'm asking you to join me, support me in this effort to defeat Phil Scott. Visit my website, zuckermanforvermont.com, and I really do look forward to serving as your governor and bringing your voice into the process at every step of the game. Thank you.
Thank you all. What an incredible discussion. A huge thank you to each of the candidates for joining us today, and for each of you for participating and hanging tough. You hung through this whole piece. Please be sure to visit Rights and Democracy on our website, our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube for events and information. Keep your eyes peeled as we'll be revealing our endorsed candidates, and you can find out those who are in alignment with our different platforms. Thank you so much to everyone. Please stay safe and healthy out there. Together we will win. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.